Okay, so let's jump into this really fascinating and honestly kind of wild story. It's about a small business that gets a tax bill right after getting robbed. I mean, how does that even happen? Well, to figure it out, we've got to take a peek into European Union tax law. And what we find kind of peels back the curtain on how rules made in Brussels can have some very different and sometimes very expensive consequences on the ground. So let me just ask you this. Imagine for a second your business gets robbed. Thieves break in, they take your stuff. It's a massive headache, a huge loss. The absolute last thing you'd ever expect is a letter from the tax man, right? So should you have to pay tax on the goods that were just stolen from you? It sounds completely absurd, but that's the exact question at the very heart of this case. And at the center of it all is PIGI. Now, PIGI isn't some huge multinational corporation. We're talking about a sole trader in Bulgaria, running a small business, dealing in things like agricultural products, drinks, food, the kind of business that's really the backbone of any economy. And back in 2007, PIGI's business became the victim of a crime. So here's how it all went down. The robbery happens in January 2007. The police look into it, but they hit a dead end, and the thief is never caught. And for a while, that's kind of it. But then, get this, 4 years later, in 2011, the Bulgarian tax office sends a bill demanding PIGI pay VAT on the very goods that were stolen. As you can imagine, PIGI decided to fight it. You bet they did. Now, PIGI's argument seems like total common sense. They basically said the theft was an act of force majeure. That's a legal term for something totally unforeseeable, something you just can't stop. A robbery fits that bill perfectly. So why should they be penalized for it? To understand why the tax office saw it differently, we need to do a quick crash course on 2 key VAT ideas. First up is what's called the input tax deduction. So when a business like PIGI buys goods to sell, it pays VAT on those purchases. That's the input tax. The system is set up so the business can later claim that tax back or deduct it from the VAT it collects on its own sales. It's all designed to stop taxes from just stacking up at every step of the supply chain. And all of this is built on a really important idea, the principle of VAT neutrality. The whole point of the EU's VAT system is to make sure the tax burden ends up with the final person who buys the product, the consumer. The business is just supposed to be a temporary tax collector. The tax should flow right through them, not stick to them, which, of course, brings us right back to our central mystery. If the whole system is designed to be neutral for businesses, why on earth did PGI get a bill demanding they pay back the VAT on goods that were gone? They were stolen. They could never be sold to a final consumer. It just seems to fly in the face of the entire principle. All right, to crack this nut, we have to go straight to the source. We're talking about the EU's main rulebook for VAT, the 2006 VAT Directive. The answer to PIGI's entire problem is hidden away in one specific part, Article 185, which is all about adjusting those tax deductions we were just talking about. And when you look at Article 185, paragraph 2, the law seems crystal clear. It says that if a business can prove a theft happened, it does not have to make a tax adjustment. Now, PIGI had a police report confirming the theft, so PIGI shouldn't have to pay. Case closed, right? It really does feel that simple. A duly proved theft means you're in the clear. PIGI had the proof. This should be an open and shut case. But this is where EU law gets, a little tricky. What looks like a clear, simple rule often has a twist in the tail. And that's exactly what we find here, because right there, after the main rule, there's a huge however. The directive says that member states may, and that one little word changes everything. They may require an adjustment for theft. It's an optional exception. So the EU sets a default rule, but then it turns to each country and says, hey, you can choose to do the exact opposite if you want. And guess what? That's exactly what Bulgaria did. When it wrote its own national law based on the EU directive, it took that option. But its law didn't use the word theft. Instead, it said you had to make a tax adjustment for any shortfall of goods. And well, a theft is a pretty big shortfall, isn't it? So this whole mess eventually ends up at the highest court in the European Union, the European Court of Justice. After all the legal arguments, the entire thing boiled down to one single make or break question. The court had to decide, was Bulgaria's law, the one using the word shortfall, a valid way to use the EU's optional rule about theft? I mean, PIGI's team argued it wasn't an exact match. The Bulgarian tax office said it was close enough. Was a law about a shortfall a legitimate way to use the power that was granted for theft? And then the court delivered its final verdict. It ruled that the EU directive does not stop a country from making a business pay this tax adjustment for stolen goods. And here's the kicker. Even if the thief was never found. The court basically said a member state's choice to demand the payment is valid no matter what the circumstances of the theft were. So the answer from the court was a clear and simple yes. Bulgaria was perfectly within its rights. The court agreed that since a theft causes a shortfall, using that word in the law, was a totally valid way to apply the EU's optional rule. And for PIGI, unfortunately, that meant the tax bill stood. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, this case shows us a few really critical things. First, VAT law is not the same everywhere in the EU. Not by a long shot. The EU directives give countries a framework, but they have a ton of flexibility. This means a business in Bulgaria might have to repay VAT on stolen stuff, but a business somewhere else might not. In some places, the risk of a crime falls squarely on the business owner. And it proves that just having a police report isn't always enough to protect you if the local law says something different. And that leaves us with this final, much bigger question that goes way beyond the legal text. See, the idea of that is to tax the final consumer. But when goods are stolen, there is no final consumer. This case forces us to ask, who should have to absorb the financial hit from a crime? Should it be the individual business owner who is the victim, or should it be society as a whole, through a tax system that just writes off the loss? It's a really tough question about risk, responsibility, and what fairness actually means in the real world.